Welcome to Toby's Student Expert Podcast. On this platform, Toby will engage with student experts, their field of study, passions and interests. My name is Barney Rubble. My field of study is, I suppose, crossing over between depth psychology, mysticism, cosmology, culture, ecology, mental health.
In this episode, several topics were covered, including Buddhism, depth psychology, Carl Jung, and even the Saturnine circle was covered. A little later on you will hear a continuity error, quite a brief continuity error, but it will all make sense, so please be patient. Otherwise, please enjoy.
What do I mean by the field of depth psychology?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm not a an expert. Well, I was going to say is I'm not an expert generally in psychology, but I would say that I do have some level of expertise in specifically depth psychology,
Right.
and I distinguish it in this way. I suppose I would understand depth psychology as including certain figures from the past, which you'd probably say began with William James, and went through, you know, famous names like Freud, Jung, Carl Jung.
Can I just interject, just for the listeners?
Yeah.
Can you talk briefly about William James and what he was known for?
Okay.
Because some of the listeners might not know.
Sure. So William James was probably best known for his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and you would probably be best understanding him as the point at which psychology and religion first came under the spotlight in the same study, I suppose. So his approach to psychology was moving into the direction of transpersonal psychology, which is what you might call spiritual psychology.
Right.
So he straddled the fields of psychology and religion, and was arguably the first to do that as clearly as he did.
Okay, so what's interesting me about that particular thing is spirituality and psychology. Spirituality is kind of says to me kind of intuitive and knowing. But psychology, I know there's kind of some disagreement about this, but psychology is largely a science, isn't it?
Okay, so let's get etymological, or let's talk about roots of words so that we can really define spiritual and psychological. So you've got to get Greek with psychological, psyche as in soul. So learning about the soul. Anything with analogy is a learning about. So
the psyche is the soul in Greek.
Psyche is mythologically a Greek figure,
but isn't
that is soul.
But isn't that directly related to the mind though? Like the psychic is of the mind.
Well, and there you have it. So if you look etymologically at our word, which includes as a prefix psychology, psychotherapy, etc., that it begins with the word soul. So soul and mind, at least in the Greek understanding, were not separate. So spirit and mind,
when they
you might
said
say,
the
are not
psyche,
separate.
they saw the mind, the soul located in the mind.
I'm not a Greek scholar, but I would say yes, that's the way I understand it. Okay. And I suppose I might think about the Chinese character for heart, which actually is heart-mind together. So the two characters in one. So heart-mind are they're not heart. It's not heart and mind. It's heart mind. So it's so spirit, soul, psychology are, I guess, where I was getting to. Is that they're the same. It's a false dichotomy to say religion and psychology to some extent. They're fields of study, and you can have a dichotomy in that sense. But in terms of my approach would be, there is a huge crossover. Actually, that it's a false distinction to say that we can study the psyche and our psychological experience and understand that approach as not being a spiritual study. I would say that a psychological study is a spiritual study, and that actually the word spiritual is loaded from New Age, recent New Age past, that it's probably misleading. I don't really like the word spiritual. I don't think it's useful. It's too nebulous.
Nebulous?
Yeah, it's too cloudy. It's too. It doesn't point to anything specific, and when you're having a discourse, you need to be specific. And I think.
But then again, I get what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. But then, with most words, even because I did a psychology module for the listeners, I just graduated in comparative literature undergraduate.
Yeah.
And in my second year, I did a philosophy module called Justice, Violence and the State. And even in with those many of those words that they use in psychology, in philosophy, you have to kind of define how you're using the word.
Okay, but
not necessarily.
Let me make it much more simple then. 3 words: colour, red, scarlet.
Okay.
And that's increasing in specificity and focus, and that's all I'm really saying. That the word spiritual is less specific.
So in that understanding, the word spiritual kind of equates to saying colour.
Yeah, it covers too much ground. What's spiritual? Well, a lot of stuff's spiritual, but actually what we're talking about, probably I would be moving towards words like mystical experience would be closer to what I would understand as the field that I'm interested in as expertise. Less spiritual, more mystical experience. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's more specific.
But then, I kind of get what you're saying, but.
So let me put it let me give then a distinction. So
let me ask this question first, and then go from there.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the spiritual and mystical experience? Because what I get from the mystic or the mystical is kind of not a knowledge of the unknown, but a kind of knowledge of what the unknown is, and a knowledge that the unknown exists and you can't know it. So how is that more specific than using the word spiritual?
Okay. Because it is focusing on experience. So you said spiritual experience there, which was 2 words, not 1. So if you take the word,
that what you said?
No. What I'm saying is, I don't think it did. If I did, then I'm sorry. What I'm talking about is the word spiritual alone can include walking into a shop in Bournemouth where there's crystal balls and books on divination, and you might say that was a spiritual experience. You could I think fairly say that walking into a crystal ball shop is a spiritual experience. You could also say going to see a tarot reader is a spiritual experience. Okay. I personally would find it hard to equate those things with mystical experience.
Okay.
Okay, and the way that I would define mystical experience would be that which moves into a non-dual, unmediated space. So it's possible to do spiritual things that can be understood as a spiritual experience. And you could say mystical experience is a little bit like, well, if we've got colour, red and scarlet, colour equates to spiritual, then maybe red equates to mystical experience, and maybe scarlet is tantric practice or something like that. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So you could have a specifically tantric mystical experience which is spiritual, right? So there's your family tree in a way.
But isn't that the way that people use language? So like in
It's structural, yeah.
100 years or so,
Yeah.
people could start using the word mystical experience in the same way.
Well, now are we talking about language or are we talking about the subject? Because the
Well,
danger is that we go off, and because what you can do when you start talking about language is you can say, okay, well, if we talk about language as literal, it's one thing. You talk about language as symbolic, it's another. So a mantra is use of language, but it has an entirely different purpose and experience attached to it. A mantra is absolutely not about having a contextual, being part of a constructed framework that gives meaning. A mantra is about something that actually penetrates through the sound of the word, through the diagram of the word, to an experience that is beyond that word entirely.
Right.
And beyond is probably a useful word for where we're heading as well. The word beyond, I think, is really pivotal in understanding mystical experience, because whatever it is that you think it is, that you feel it is, well, it's beyond that. Always.
But going back to language briefly,
Yeah.
you said on the one hand it's language can be symbolic, like transcendence and mystical experience, or the use of words. But to a greater or lesser degree, aren't all words symbolic of something?
Yes, but I suppose it's about whether it's understood to be functional or whether it's understood to be transformative. So it's the difference, I suppose, between a sign that tells you to be careful when you walk over that bridge with a particular symbol on it, or that same symbol actually being quite unspecific but allowing you to use that symbol to get to a different level of understanding. So okay, let's think of a good one. Alright, let's use I'm not a Christian expert, but let's use the cross. A cross can be understood as crossroads ahead. It's a clear one, that's pretty specific, that's a sign. Or it can be used as, this is the crucifix, and if you engage with that symbol enough, you may come to a mystical experience where that symbol actually catalyses an experience in the viewer around dying through the opposites. In other words, understanding oneself as not actually being binary, but being non-dual, and that the symbol itself catalyses an experience of that non-dual reality. So now the symbol's opening out, it's not closing down. And it's the same with language, that a word can either be specific and pointing to something functional, literal, solid, or it can be opening, I suppose, in some way, and pointing to something beyond.
Can you go into briefly, because I've heard this word a lot, but I'm not really sure what it actually means. When you say non-dual,
Okay.
what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? So, dualism, there's a philosophical history of dualism versus non-dualism, and then there's a religious history. Academically speaking, I will not speak about the philosophical approach, but from a religious point of view, dualism would be the idea that there is an ultimate separation that exists in divine reality.
So that's dualism.
That's dualism. Non-dualism would be the idea that, let's take that, let's use the word God. There's a good one. And let's say that where non-dualism is concerned, there would be no difference between myself, yourself, and God, or consciousness, or Brahman, or the Tao, or whatever word you want to use. Except it's not the same as, and this is important, let me get this really clear. Not two is not the same as one. And that is a really important understanding in this. So, to be one, an experience, is not the same as to be not two. So, a great image for this is when you put your hands together in that prayer shape, right? So you see it in Christianity, you see it in Hinduism, you see it in Buddhism. In Buddhism, what it means when you put the hands together is when your hands are together, your two hands come together, and they're together as one, but they're also separate as two, but they're not two. So there it is.
Right.
That is non-dualism.
So that's kind of...
It's not twoism.
Right, yeah.
Which is not the same as oneism. Because one is complete, but not two is not. Not two has this open scope for constant no self. I mean, it's there in, I suppose, more than anything, front and centre in Buddhist thinking, in Buddhist philosophy, which is the idea, you know, the three core elements of Buddhism: impermanence, no self, and dukkha. Three marks of existence. And the first one, impermanence, relates to the idea of no self, because the idea is that the more we investigate and look into our experience, the more we realise that there is no fixed abode, there is no one thing that we can hold on to that remains. And so we're empty. But at the same time as we're empty, we're full. Right?
Right.
Okay.
I've heard of that idea of
yeah.
Emptiness and
sunyata is in Buddhism, and it's the idea that there is no permanent self, and it's not just about human self. The idea of self is no fixed anything. You know? I think a lot of that is actually supported by quantum physics and quantum mechanics as well. The idea of emptiness. So, non-dualism is, I suppose, related to that idea of no self and impermanence and flux. Yeah.
Can we go from this idea of emptiness and get a bit deeper into that, and then, because you briefly touched on quantum physics as well, and can you so briefly go into what emptiness means, why it's not empty, why it's empty and not empty at the same time?
Right. So now we're getting down to it in some quite idiosyncratic Buddhist philosophy, really. So there is a very in Buddhist academic circles anyway, a very well known, I suppose, statement, which is a quadruplex. It has four angles to it, and it was first disseminated in something called the Madhyamika Karika. Karika is just a term really for a spiritual text. Madhyamika it really means the middle way. The middle way.
Right, yeah.
The idea of the middle way is that if we don't go fully right or we don't go fully left, and we go fully middle, well, where actually is that fully middle? You know, the more you think about it, it's an impossible centre. You know, that if you think about it, that the middle is that it's impossible to actually reach that absolute centre.
So,
but
I know we're digressing all over the place, but I want to get into that.
I'll bring it together to the idea of emptiness.
Yeah.
So within.
Sorry, before you do that, I'm really interested in this idea of the middle way.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. That comes from
Buddhism. Yeah.
But it's the Buddha himself, Siddhartha.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, very briefly touch on that, and then go back to.
Okay. So, the best way to approach how the Buddha outlined why the middle way. Well,
because he was
there's a historical
aesthetic, wasn't he?
Well, there's a historical
originally
myth, and then there's, I think, probably a good framework to talk about. I can do it quite quickly. So, historically, the Buddha lived as a prince, as part of something called the Kshatriya clan, really, which were a warrior clan, but also quite rich and high up caste royalty. And he realised that outside of the palace walls, suffering was occurring: old age, sickness, death, everything that he'd actually been kept away from. That's a very quick overview of a longer story, but the long and short of it is that he decided he wanted to pursue the spiritual path at the age of 29 or 30. That always interests me because the age of 29 is the Saturnine circle. So it's said that every 29 years on the return of Saturn that big changes occur. I suppose then it's useful to say that he tried to follow spiritual teachers and teamed up with different yogi, mastered their paths, and almost disappeared into nothing physically. So he became a skeleton of a man. And there are some quite harrowing pictures of the Buddha just on the edge of death. Realised that's probably not the way, and then he moved into the opposite, into a hedonistic lifestyle, and realised that actually what would be for him a truer, if you like, a dangerous word, a truer spiritual path would be to pursue the middle way. So that's the myth of the middle way.
Now, for my own personal kind of ponderings, I'd like to get something clear very briefly.
Yeah.
Now, there's the idea of political, like modern politics, left and right, extreme left, extreme right, but also centre left and centre right. So there's that idea of the middle way in politics as well.
Yeah, there is.
However, the political middle way seems to be. I think a lot of people look at it as something good and something proper, like to be liberal, to be liberal-minded.
I think that is a dangerous overlay, because my understanding of a political middle way would probably be something like mediocrity or something like that. I think what we're talking about is the middle way is something that cannot be apprehended, and that's really important.
Okay.
It can't be cerebrally, it can't be conceptually, intellectually understood. It's not something to be understood, it's something to be experienced.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's it, yeah.
So the middle way is the beyond, is the non-dual, is the alternate non-dual. So we have left, we have right, there's a duality. We have black, we have white, there's a duality. This isn't about grey, this is about ultimate grey beyond. This is about absolutely beyond the idea of black and white. Something that cannot be perceived, understood, can only be, it's in the experience alone. It's beyond words.
So to go back to some things you were saying earlier, where certain words are more symbolic than others, like mystical experience.
Yep.
You're
Okay.
saying that the middle way is more the
Okay.
what those words mean, rather than the words themselves.
So, what I would say is, and now we're getting kind of into the realm of, let's say, comparative mysticism, that there are several Buddhisms even that would use the same word in many different ways. Tibetan Buddhism would use words, objects, symbols, potentially as a portal for transformation. So any object has the potential to be powerful and transformative. In the Pure Land tradition, words are there to give up, submit, surrender to Amida Buddha. So words have a different function. They're there to submit. Why does this lead to an experience of the non-dual? Because in the Pure Land tradition, in the same way as the Sufi tradition, submission and surrender is emptying the vessel of the ego to allow consciousness of God in. It's a different use of words and prayer. In the Zen tradition, for example, at the end of the Heart Sutra in Japanese, gate gate hara gate hara pas hara parasangate, on and on and on and on, is a way of drilling through any form of meaning. So gate gate hara gate hara hara gate hara gate gate hara gate hara gate hara gate gate, beyond any meaning of word, a repetition of any kind, goes beyond the sound, beyond the meaning of the word, to penetrate through to the immediate experience of this right now, this present moment. Entirely different to Tantric, Tibetan, entirely different to Sufi, and entirely different to the main form of Buddhism that people come across, Theravadan Buddhism, where everything is actually explained. Everything is explained and clear and literal. So words in all those traditions have an entirely different function, but lead potentially to the non-dual liberating experience. And all of those uses of language are different to the, let's say, purely structural, purely functional, relativistic use of words that we are so preoccupied with in modern life.
So you've just briefly talked about certain practices, certain rituals, like the Heart Sutra in Japanese, that particular Buddhism, that is the purpose of which is to go beyond the words, not to make the words meaningless, but to go beyond the meaning of the words, to go into the experience, like the Sufis and stuff.
In the same way that washing up can.
Yeah. That you just reminded me of. I'm thinking of Stuart Lee. It's not Stuart Lee. It's Bruce Lee. When there's one of the things he talks about.
Don't look at the finger, that one.
No. He talks about because it was after he had the major operation on his back, and he had to be flat out.
Right.
And he read just churns and churns of philosophy books. And he incorporated it into his Jeet Kune Do. And he was talking about, and I think he actually spoke about this on one of his TV programs. And he said when water goes into a cup or a kettle, that the water fills the cup, so be the cup, my friend. He says. So I don't know why.
That's it. That is it. And when anything like that is said, whether it's by Bruce Lee or Dogen, who was a Zen monk, or even by Shinran, who is a Pure Land, an old Pure Land monk and scholar, that what they're all saying really is there's no difference, that separating oneself through our delusion of reality, in other words, we have a delusional view of reality which continues to separate us, and that is the basis for suffering. That's the basis for suffering, is that separation, dukkha. That's the third mark of existence, is dukkha in Buddhist philosophy. So the idea is that if we can penetrate the experience of being two, dual and separate, and we can come upon an experience of being not two, then our suffering will be immediately diminished, because we will not be adding an extra layer of pain. There's having a broken leg, and then there's having a broken leg and the poor me that goes on top of it. And it's the second layer of suffering that dukkha's looking at, because a broken leg's just a broken leg.
So to bring that briefly into kind of, again, political thinking, but to kind of get a realistic idea of it.
Yep.
The not two but not one idea. So what I'm thinking of is the idea of consumerism and individuality that's promoted. So we are all individuals, or the Margaret Thatcher quote, there is no such thing as society. So can you, not that I want to talk about politics particularly, but can you comment on that and sort of, if you want to?
What are you asking?
Well, it's just interesting the way that...
Yeah, I can comment on it. I mean, what a leap, really, from the Buddha to Margaret Thatcher. All right, okay. I suppose what would be actually really fair is to say that the Buddha was both intensely conservative and as radical as a person can be.
Right. It's like logic, Margaret Thatcher.
And there you are.
In some ways.
Right. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I suppose the agendas, you might say, come across as different. The Buddha starts with, he has an agenda. Yeah, he has an agenda, and it is to get to the heart of the root of suffering, to get to the root of suffering. I think Maggie Thatcher's agenda was more political and ultimately self-driven. So it's ultimately egoic. You could psychologise the reasons behind Maggie Thatcher's decisions. Well, that type of conservatism pervaded by Margaret Thatcher really was all about, wasn't it? The individual as a separate entity from society. In a way, philosophically, you might say then that it's about as juxtaposed to the Buddha's philosophy as anything can be, because he's saying that actually no, we are essentially in a flux, which means that we're one part of, let's say, an ecology. So in the same way that an ant is a part of a colony, which is part of a jungle, which is part of a etc., that actually we're connected in the same way. I think there's a huge crossover between ecological thinking and Buddhist thinking, Now, is there a crossover between Margaret Thatcher's approach and ecological thinking? I would say absolutely not. It actually sits more on the misinterpretation of Darwin, which is survival of the fittest understood as survival as the strongest, no, versus survival as the fittest understood as survival of the most successfully cooperative. And that actually is really, I would say, is where Darwin was coming from. I'm sure there's people out there would argue with that, but you know, in that sense, those of us that fit the best, that are most ecologically sound, that understand our connection as not separate but intrinsically connected to the flux of things, is very much in line with the Buddha's thinking. And I believe that that is not the intention of Margaret Thatcher. I believed that she believed in a trickle-down economics idea where if we benefit, everyone benefits, not through interaction but through byproduct. I don't believe that is a route away from suffering. I believe is a route towards, because it's about separation, it's about division, it's about disconnection.
Now this is interesting. I don't know if the microphone is picking this up, but there's some young guys, I think possibly theatre people.
And now, introducing the continuity error.
So those guys outside, I briefly spoke to them. They're doing some kind of, I can't remember what play it was, but it was a Shakespeare play. But the noise that they were making was quite interesting for me. And that all... Actually, I don't want to frame the question too much. But I'll go back to that idea of kind of breaking through the language and going through making, like using mantras to break through the meaning of words.
Okay, so there's a connection between the dancing outside, the fact that they were all...
Where's the noise?
They were in a mantra, really, weren't they?
But what I want to say is that it's universal. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily connected to religion or ritual. I mean, you.
Oh, here, hang on. Right,
clubbing,
stop. Right.
Certain music.
I would say it is, and this is the point. This goes back to the start. Actually, maybe it's a good kind of way to move to sort of start completing the circle in a way of an interview, because I think things come back. You're saying, and I understand what you mean, that maybe it's not just in the realm or ownership of religion to have a mantra. No, it's not. But I would flip that or invert it, and I would say actually it's all spiritual. This is the point.
Well, yeah.
You know, and I know that you and I have had this conversation before, that the core of my understanding in my experience is that art, culture, that expression is religious experience. So good art does catalyse religious experience, spiritual experience. Forget religion, forget spirituality, call it transformation, call it psychological awareness, call it awakening, call it what you like, but it's a movement to that which was previously beyond. You're in one experience, and what transformation is something beyond that experience that you were in to start with. It's a growth. It is entirely different, a different taste, you know. So art, mantra, words do, from one perspective, I think, have the potential for transformation and to go beyond, whether you call it religious or not.
So let me ask you, going from that last point.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something that I've been kind of conceptually toying with myself, and it's that idea of the that universal experience, that universal spiritual, mystical experience that everyone has the ability to engage with and acknowledge. And I think people connect with that with certain music, certain rituals, certain performances, certain social gatherings as well. But also the use of drugs, alcohol,
sport, being in the zone.
Yeah.
So we know it when we feel it.
Yeah. So what I want to ask you about, if you can engage with this, is when people engage with that kind of intangible but very specific experience, but do it in such a way that is like drugs and alcohol, that that they do it in an addictive way or an unhealthy way.
I think I know where this question is
going. And I think that can be also in terms of music as well.
Okay.
In social gatherings.
Can I address that really specifically?
Yeah.
So, addiction is a really interesting urge. I think we've got to get a little bit Jungian here, because I would understand addiction as we have within us, from certain traditions, Jungian, tantric, an urge to unite aspects of ourselves, which you might say parallels the uniting of elements cosmologically. So the universe is having sex with itself. We are undergoing a process of alchemy. What do I mean by that? From a Jungian perspective, we project out into the world all the time our persona. Our persona is a way of navigating the world. So it's a strength. We say, right, all of these elements that I project out there, I'm a hard worker, I'm a good guy, and I've got great dress sense. The aspects that we don't want to identify at all with would be, I'm lazy, I'm unfriendly, and I'm scruffy, right? So when we see anyone come up in the world that's lazy, scruffy, we immediately push them away. Well, actually, the urge coming up in us is to unite those elements which we've rejected away from ourselves. Now, that's the urge, I believe, that comes up in us. It comes up as a demiurge. It comes up as what Jung would call what truly is the libido. Freud understood the libido as sexual. Jung understood the libido as the urge that is asking us to unite our shadow elements, those things that we do not like, and integrate them into our ego and draw the persona in so that we become more individuated, more whole, more complete. Now, here's the thing. That urge that comes up can be misunderstood. And when that urge is understood more as a craving for filling a hole, that's where addiction, I believe, comes in. When we do not have the capacity or knowledge or initiations or community or context to handle what needs to be integrated, instead what we do is we move to a craving or an addiction, which very effectively actually contains that urge. It contains it. It enables us to not have to face that urge. So whether it's Netflix, drink, a spliff, eating, sex, whatever it is, all those urges are very good actually at doing a containing job. But actually what it is, it's an inversion of the spiritual urge. The spiritual urge asks us to create a space, to listen, and to integrate. What an addiction does is it contains things, but actually allows us to transcend it in a negative way and brush it under the carpet. So rather than attend to the stuff that's coming up, we float above it, and for many years actually can avoid the most burning questions, the most uniquely burning questions for ourselves. That is the spiritual path, really. It's attending to those uniquely burning questions, integrating those things together, and making the thing that's two, the persona and the shadow, into not two, something that's integrated as a flux. So that's where he kind of meets with Buddhism and other philosophies like that. Right.
Just briefly, I don't know how long we've got. So briefly, I just want to touch on, because I know when we talk about that kind of longing and need to transcend, as in what addicts go through. But I've noticed knowing a lot of people in addiction, actually, and knowing more about it nowadays, I've actually looked at people that are not addicts or alcoholics, and I see the exact same people, same things and behaviours in non-addicts as I do in addicts. So apart from the abuse, the substance abuse.
But there's, as with anything, there's a spectrum to habitual behaviour. I think it goes from basic habits through compulsions up to addiction. So, you know, you've got, you know, a guy like me who eats toast before bed every night. Is that an addiction? Yes. In the sense that what's it doing? Is it a window for me to attend to my emotional and psycho-spiritual content, or is it a way for me to contain it till the next day? Well, it's the latter, isn't it? It's, you know, a couple of bits of toast before bed do something for me. You know, that crap on Netflix does something for me. It contains. One would hope that what you do is you try as much as possible to create spaces where actually you do attend to that stuff, so you reduce the negative impact. I mean, we're moving really into mental health now, aren't we? You know, but we can see how there's all these crossovers. But going back to your observation of people that are not labelled as addicts and seeing those same behaviours, well, precisely is why I think that we have to be careful about pathologising any mental health issue, whether it's addiction or whatever, because actually it's the human condition.
Well, that's the thing, like, knowing a lot of addicts and alcoholics, I hear a lot that they say no one's as mad as us. But
that's an identity, isn't it? And this is the danger, actually, of addiction, is that second layer of identity. You know, the guy who not only is addicted to smoking cannabis, but actually is known to be Mr. Spliffy, or whatever his name is. He's known to be, you know, Jake the Smoke, or whatever it is. You know, he's that guy. And on top of that, you know, he's developed it as a way of navigating the world. So the addiction is multiple, actually. It's got these multiple onion skin layers to it. So it's a lot to unpick or unpeel, you know. And then what are you going to do when the identity goes away? I mean, what could be more terrifying than someone stripping you of who you think you are?
So it's a new identity.
Right. But here's the thing.
It's connected to the old.
I believe that authentic is a funny word, but let's say it. An authentic experience of that which is beyond, of the non-dual consciousness, pure love, of bliss state, I believe gives us enough to move away from our addiction to identity, and that's the hardest one. So if we can gradually stop grasping onto identity, it really is the road, I think, away from all of that suffering. And how? By developing our experience of the beyond. How? By creating space for bliss states to come up and come in, by allowing us to shift naturally into an experience of the beyond. And that's through meditation and contemplative stuff, prayer, whatever. Yeah.
So that could be something that we could sort of briefly touch on, or however briefly you want, to wrap up, really.
Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you've just said there is kind of connected to what you said earlier on about the empty, like it's something being empty but not empty.
Yeah.
And from what I've heard about sort of Hinduism and Buddhism, there's the idea of non-attachment.
Yeah.
So not attached to name, relationships, and and different things.
Yeah, it's sticky. You know, the ego is sticky, identity is sticky, extremely sticky. It's like flypaper. You know, you think you've got, I mean, an example from the Buddhist tradition is You know, you have Shinran, who believed that to begin with he could do it all on his own, so he went through the Zen path of doing away with his ego, and then he realised actually the ultimate, let's say, arrogance was in believing that he could do it all on his own, that he had what it took. And actually that moved him from jiriki, which means self-power, to tariki, which means other power, which is, well, I can't do it, I'm going to submit because I realise that actually it's so sticky, this ego stuff, that the I that's trying to do it, is the stickiness. So I'm just going to let someone else do it. And that's where the surrender to Amida comes in, or God, you know, I can't do it, you do it. So I would say really the core, I suppose, of non-attachment is about allowing, probably a good word is vulnerability. Another one would be big trust, which some people, they use the word faith in different ways. For me, faith is big trust. It's cultivating ultimate trust, and a good way to do that is to gradually allow oneself to fade away, to allow all those dramas that come up to be seen but not judged, and then to let something else come through. I think there's a term called the Johari window, and I think it's something along the lines of that. You know, something will break through if you cultivate the right context, and
right.
that probably ultimately is connected to non-attachment.
So I think that was a fantastic first recording. I really enjoyed doing the edit and everything, and thank Barney so much for helping me with that. I was particularly interested in going through depth psychology and the connection between psychology and spirituality, particularly in terms of the psychologists that I've met and also viewed on TV. I always found psychologists to be quite cold and rational. The connection between psychology and spirituality, or the mystical experience, as he says, is a very interesting one for me. Also, the idea of the non-dual, so the not two but not one, and I think that was perfectly illustrated by whilst doing the interview, hearing the students and the student production, the rehearsal of the student production. From the Canterbury Shakespeare Festival. As far as I know, they're all students. If I get this out before, please go and check it out online. Canterbury Student Festival. It's actually opening today, the day I'm doing this recording, the 4th of August. Hopefully I can get it out soon so you can see some of that. So I'll be doing an interview with Tom Holton, who is the director of the, I think it's Othello, the production they were rehearsing. So I hope to do an interview with him at some point. So I suppose it's left for me to say thank you for listening, whoever's listening currently. Look me up on iTunes. Like, subscribe and review, it would really help me out, and as much as you can, share on social media, get me out there, so to speak. So thank you very much, and I look forward to future interviews with various different people. I've got a few people lined up already, so thank you.